Hi everyone, this is the story of the Book of Negroes, a list of over 3,000 Black Americans that the British transported to safety and freedom after the Revolutionary War. Black Americans, especially those who are descendants of American slaves, have a difficult time tracing their family tree back before the Civil War. They can't just pop onto sites like Ancestry.com and expect to find the same resources that are available to non-Blacks. Stick around and I'll tell you why. Welcome to the WOW History Channel. My name is Ron Guth, and each week I present a topic that made me say wow when I first learned about it, and one which I hope will make you say wow too. Slavery was a massive disruption to the lives of American slaves. Until the slave trade was abolished in 1808 in America, many slaves were imported directly from Africa, crossing the Atlantic essentially as cargo in ships designed to carry a maximum capacity of human beings. Now, just because slave trading became illegal doesn't mean it stopped. According to the slavevoyages.org website, almost 112,000 slaves began the voyage to America between 1801 and 1875, but only 92,065 made it. That means that almost 20,000 slaves perished in the transatlantic journey. Unfortunately, the personal data on virtually all of the 92,000 slaves has been lost. No birth dates, no baptismal records, no wedding dates, no names of children, no dates of death. It's as if these people never existed. Many slaves took on American names, including the surnames of their owners, thereby wiping out their African names. Husbands were separated from wives, children from parents, and sold off to other slave owners with little or no records of the transactions. That is why it is nearly impossible for Black Americans to trace their roots to any life before the U.S. Civil War. The efforts to rebuild this database of American slaves is ongoing, but hampered by a lack of records and sometimes conflicting information. This is why we celebrate any time a trove of information is discovered that contains information that relates to Black history. When I talked about Evacuation Day in episode 20, I mentioned how the British took American slaves with them to freedom as they left New York City. In episode 22, I talked about how the British enticed American slaves to come over to their side during the Revolutionary War in exchange for their freedom. Well, when the British left, they kept a meticulous record of the Black Americans they took with them. Part of the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783 to end the war between America and Great Britain, America insisted that any blacks controlled by the British be returned to America, where they would be restored to their former owners or their former freedom, or even be resold if their status could not be determined. Now, the British agreed with this, but when it came time to leave, the British decided that it would be inhumane to return them. So instead, they put them on ships and moved them to Canada, which remained a British colony. Naturally, the Americans were incensed, but in the end decided that it was not worth going back to war over the situation, and the matter was dropped. Now, not all the blacks that were taken by the British were slaves. Some were indentured servants, or they were free men and women. But nevertheless, the British and Americans kept identical records in case the British were ever asked to pay back the Americans for the slaves they lost. And even today, it's unclear if any reparations were ever paid. Now, the British version of the book is called the Book of Negroes, mainly because of the title page, which says Book of Negroes. It's part of the papers of Sir Guy Carleton, who was the commander-in-chief of the British forces in America in 1783, and the one who oversaw the evacuation from New York, and he was the one who decided that he was not going to return the blacks that were on the British side. The Carlton Papers were once owned by John D. Rockefeller, and they were displayed at Colonial Williamsburg early on. But in 1957, the Book of Negroes was gifted back to Britain and became part of their national archives. The American version, known as the Inspection Roll of Negroes, Book 1, is currently part of the U.S. National Archives. Now, these two companion documents, the Book of Negroes and the Inspection Roll of Negroes, Book 1, were united for the first time since 1783 in 2019, when they were featured as part of the Forgotten Soldier exhibit at the Museum of the American Revolution in Yorktown, Virginia. I mean, that's a pretty cool exhibit. These two documents that have been separated for how many years? Scores, dozens, decades of years, centuries. They were finally reunited and put on exhibition. Unfortunately, that exhibition closed in July of 2020, and probably few people got to see it in 2020 because of COVID. But now these two documents presumably have gone their separate ways, and I'm not really sure whether they were returned to the National Archives in their respective countries, but it sure would be nice to find out where they've ended up. The Book of Negroes includes the names of over 3,000 Black Americans with specific data attached to each one of them. Now, I'll leave a link in the description below that will actually take you to images of the actual book so that you can see for yourself what the entries look like. And a little bit later in this episode, I'm going to tell you about some of the highlights that I saw when I went through it. The list was assembled by Samuel Birch on the British side and his American counterparts under the orders of Guy Carlton, who oversaw, as I said before, the evacuation of New York. Now, Birchtown in Nova Scotia is named after Samuel Birch, and the large majority of evacuated Blacks ended up in Nova Scotia. Now, that's another story all by itself, and I'll discuss that in a future episode to kind of give you an idea of what happened to the Black people that went to Nova Scotia. The Book of Negroes consists of numerous columns. It's basically just a database or a record of the Blacks that were transported by the British. The columns include the name of the transport vessel that took them away, the destination of the vessel, the names of the individuals, their age, their description, the names of any claimants and their place of residence, and the names of persons who currently possess them at the time of their evacuation, and then there are some miscellaneous remarks. Now, the column that has the names of any claimants and their place of residence, you don't see too many entries in there because that's where people who came to the British said, hey, these are my slaves, or these people are not supposed to be on the boat, and therefore I claim them. And in some cases, the Blacks were actually pulled off the boat and returned to their owners. In going through the Book of Negroes, you will find all sorts of interesting information, much of which adds to the incomplete records of Black history. Now, on this one page, which is one of the very first ones in the book, 33 people are named, ranging in age from 5 to 70. Daniel Barber is the oldest. He was 70 years old, and he was described simply as worn out. He was currently in the possession of James Moore, but Daniel maintained that he had been set free by Mr. Austin Moore 20 years ago. The descriptions of the individual Blacks indicate how they were perceived by the recorders. So the word stout, meaning heavy or fat, appears frequently. Men were often called fellows. Women were almost always called wenches. Young men were called lads, and children were called boys and girls. Many of the evacuees were mulattoes or mixed race, and occasionally an identifying mark such as a scar or a blind eye would be mentioned. The Americanization of their names is readily apparent, as there are lots of Johns, Nancys, Tommies, Peters, and so on, names that are familiar to us today but would have never occurred over in Africa. The histories of the individual Blacks include runaways, those who earned their own freedom or were gifted it upon the death of their previous owners. They came from all over the colonies, from Norfolk, Virginia, Savannah, Georgia, North Carolina, New Jersey, and some even came from other countries such as Jamaica. Many became the property of their British captors or guardians when they went over to the British side, which may or may not have been any better for them than their previous circumstances. The Nova Scotia Archives, who has a copy of the Book of Negroes, has done a tremendous job of identifying, where possible, each of the 3,009 names found in the Book of Negroes and showing their place in the book. Now, I love source documents like this because they allow you to immerse yourself in them free of later influences and to get a real sense of how and why this document was created. Out of this book comes a slim chance that some Black Americans today can trace their ancestry back to this pivotal moment in time. Thank you for viewing this episode. If you like historical documents and presentations such as this, please consider subscribing to the channel and be sure to leave a comment below. I hope to see you next time on the WOW History channel. See you later. Bye-bye.